If this is still just a deal, then why are you holding me like I matter? The words slipped out before I could stop them, hanging between us like something fragile and dangerous, and Nathan didn't answer right away, which somehow felt worse than if he had, because silence from a man like him was never empty. It was loaded, calculated, heavy enough to press against my chest until I couldn't breathe properly. And the worst part was we were standing in the middle of a crowded rooftop gala in downtown Manhattan, city lights stretching for miles, cameras flashing, people laughing, champagne glasses clinking like none of this was real, like I wasn't standing inches away from the one person who was slowly undoing every rule I had promised myself I wouldn't break. And this was supposed to be simple. That's what I told myself 2 weeks ago when I signed the contract in his office 30 floors above the street. A clean deal, 6 weeks of pretending, show up to events, smile on cue. Let him touch my waist just long enough for the cameras to believe it, and in return, I would get more money than I'd ever seen in my life. Enough to fix everything that had been falling apart, enough to breathe again. And there had been rules, strict ones, written in sharp, unforgiving ink, no emotional involvement, no crossing the line, and the one that echoed the loudest in my head even now. If you fall in love, you leave. At the time it had sounded almost ridiculous, like something out of a bad romance movie. Because why would I ever fall for someone like Nathan Cross, a man who looked at the world like it was a boardroom deal waiting to be closed, a man who didn't smile unless it served a purpose, who didn't touch unless it meant something strategic. But somewhere between the first staged interview and the second late-night ride back to his penthouse, something shifted, not all at once, not obvious, just small things. The way his hand lingered a second too long at the small of my back when no one was watching. The way his eyes tracked me across a room, even when he was surrounded by people more important. The way he said my name quieter, softer, like it wasn't just part of the act. And I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was imagining it, that this was just proximity, just performance bleeding into something that felt real, because we were playing the roles too well. But then there were moments like this, his fingers tightening slightly around my wrist, as if letting go wasn't an option, his gaze locked on mine like he was trying to figure something out he couldn't control. And it didn't feel like acting anymore. It felt like standing too close to the edge of something I wasn't supposed to fall into, and I should have pulled away. I should have reminded him of the rules, reminded myself of the rules, but my body didn't move, my breath caught, and all I could think was that if this was still just a deal, then why did it feel like I was the only one pretending it was Ethan? Nathan said quietly, and somehow that was worse than if he had raised his voice, because he never said my name like that in public, never softened it, never let it linger, but now it did, wrapping around me in a way that felt too close, too real, and I felt my chest tighten as I forced a small laugh that sounded wrong even to my own ears, like I was trying to play a part one no longer understood, like I was reading lines from a script that had already changed without telling me. And I pulled my wrist back just slightly, not enough to make a scene, just enough to remind both of us that there were still lines, still rules, still something holding this together, even if it felt like it was slipping. And he let me go, but his fingers dragged for half a second longer than necessary, and that half second burned more than it should have, because it was not supposed to mean anything. None of this was. That was the whole point. 6 weeks, appearances, controlled interactions, clean exit, no damage. But something had already gone off script, and I could feel it in the way my thoughts kept circling back to him, in the way I noticed things I should not have noticed. Like how his tie was slightly loosened now, like how his eyes looked darker under the low lights of the city skyline, like how he was not looking at anyone else in the crowd, just me. And that was a problem. That was a very real problem, because Nathan Cross did not focus on anything without intention, and I had no idea what his intention was anymore. "You are overthinking," he said after a moment, his voice returning to that controlled, even tone that had convinced half the world he was untouchable. And maybe he was right. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe this was just part of the act evolving, getting more believable, more convincing. But if that was true, then why did it feel like I was the only one trying to pull back while he kept stepping closer? Not physically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but in all the ways that mattered, in the small, quiet spaces where pretending was supposed to stop. "We have another event tomorrow," he continued, like nothing had just happened, like I had not just asked a question that should have broken something open. "Be ready at 7. And there it was, The shift, the wall going back up. Clean, seamless, practiced, and I should have felt relieved. I should have been grateful that he was resetting things, putting us back where we belonged, inside the safe boundaries of a contract that could not hurt me if I followed it. But instead something twisted in my chest, something sharp and unexpected, like disappointment, and I hated that. I hated that more than anything, because it meant I was already too far in, already reacting to him in ways I had promised I would not, and as he turned slightly, his attention finally breaking from me to acknowledge someone calling his name across the terrace, I realized something that made my stomach drop, something I could not ignore anymore. The rules were still there, the contract was still real, but whatever this was between us was no longer following it. And the most dangerous part was not him breaking the rules. It was the fact that I was starting to want him to the next morning came too fast, like the city had decided not to give me time to think. And maybe that was for the best, because the second I let my mind slow down it went right back to him, to the way his voice had softened, to the way his hand had not let go right away, to the way none of it made sense if this was still just an arrangement. And I stared at my reflection in the mirror of the guest suite in his penthouse, adjusting the collar of a shirt that was definitely not mine. Everything about this place too clean, too precise, like it had been designed for control, for order, for someone who never let anything slip, and yet somehow I had slipped into it, into his space, into his life, into something that was starting to feel less like a role and more like a mistake I was not ready to admit. 7. I muttered to myself, glancing at the clock, because he had said 7 like it was just another schedule, just another task, like last night had not happened, like I had not crossed a line by even asking that question, and maybe he was right to ignore it. Maybe that was the smart thing to do. Pretend it did not matter, keep everything clean, keep everything simple. But my chest still felt tight, like something unfinished was sitting there, waiting. And I hated that feeling more than anything. A soft knock came from the door, precise, controlled, exactly like him. And before I could even respond it opened. Because of course it did. Because in this place nothing really waited for permission. And there he was, already dressed, already composed, suit perfectly fitted, expression unreadable, like the version of him I had met 2 weeks ago had stepped back into place. And for a second I almost believed it, almost convinced myself that I had imagined everything else. You are late, he said, not harsh, not cold, just factual, like time was something that could not be negotiated, and I glanced at the clock again. 1 minute passed, and somehow that felt like a bigger mistake than anything else. 1 minute. I said, trying to sound normal, trying to ignore the way my voice felt slightly off, like it was adjusting to something new, and he stepped closer, just enough to reach out, fingers brushing against my collar, straightening it. With a light, efficient motion that should have meant nothing. It was practical, necessary, part of the image we were supposed to maintain, but his touch lingered just a fraction longer than needed, and my breath caught before I could stop it, and I saw it, just for a second. The smallest shift in his eyes, like he noticed too, like he was aware of the way the air between us had changed, and then it was gone, replaced by that same controlled calm. Try not to look surprised when they ask about us, he said, stepping back, already moving on, already resetting the distance, and I nodded because that was what I was supposed to do. Play the role, follow the script, keep everything exactly where it belonged. But as we walked out of the suite and into the elevator, the space suddenly too small, too quiet. I realized something that made my stomach twist. It was not the public moments that were getting to me, not the cameras, not the staged smiles or the rehearsed lines. It was this, the in-between, the seconds where no one else was watching, where nothing was supposed to be happening, and yet everything was. And when his hand rested lightly at the small of my back as the elevator doors closed, a gesture so subtle, it could have been nothing, I knew I was already in trouble, because this was not part of the deal, and I was starting to want it anyway. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have, like time stretched just enough to make every second noticeable, every small movement louder than it had any right to be, and I stood there staring straight ahead at the reflective metal doors, trying not to think about the way his hand was still resting at the small of my back, light, steady, intentional, like it belonged there, like it had always been there. And I told myself it was for show, even though there was no one here to see it, no cameras, no audience, no reason to keep up appearances. And that was exactly the problem. Because if this was not for anyone else, then who was it for? The door slid open with a soft chime, and the moment broke, clean and sharp, like someone had cut a thread before it could tighten any further, and he stepped forward first, removing his hand as if it had never been there at all, like that. Contact had not meant anything, like I had imagined the weight of it, and I followed, adjusting my jacket, forcing my expression back into something neutral, something controlled, something safe. The lobby was already buzzing, polished floors, quiet conversations, the kind of place where everything was deliberate, where nothing was left to chance, and it suited him perfectly. Of course it did. This was his world, structured, predictable, easy to navigate, unlike whatever was happening between us. "Remember what we discussed," he said as we moved toward the waiting car outside, his voice calm, measured, back to that tone that made everything sound like a business arrangement, and I nodded because I knew the script, knew exactly how to play this part, smile when needed, respond when spoken to, lean in just enough to make it believable. And for a moment I almost relaxed, almost slipped back into that mindset where everything was simple again, just a role, just a performance, until the car door closed behind us and the space shifted, smaller, quieter, more private, and he sat beside me, closer than necessary, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth from his shoulder. And I focused on the window, on the blur of the city passing by, anything but him, anything but the way my thoughts kept circling back to last night, to this morning, to every moment that did not fit into the clean lines of our agreement. "You handled yourself well," he said after a few seconds, and I blinked, turning slightly because that was not something he said often, not without purpose, not without reason. And there was something different in the way he said it, quieter, less like an evaluation and more like something else I could not quite name. "That is what I am here for," I replied, keeping my voice steady, keeping it light, because that was safer, because that kept everything exactly where it was supposed to be. And he hummed softly, like he was considering something, like he was weighing a thought he had not decided to share, and then his hand moved again, not to my wrist this time, not to guide or direct, just resting briefly over mine where it sat on the seat. Between us, a simple gesture, nothing dramatic, nothing that would stand out to anyone else, but it was enough to send a quiet jolt through me, because it was unnecessary, because it was not part of the act, because it felt like something real trying to slip through the cracks, and I froze for half a second, just enough to notice it, just enough to feel it, before I slowly pulled my hand back, not abruptly, not enough to make it obvious, just enough to create space, to remind both of us that there was still a line, still something we were not supposed to cross. And when I glanced at him, expecting that calm indifference, that easy retreat back into control, I did not find it. Because for the briefest moment his expression shifted, something flickering there, something almost like frustration, or maybe something deeper, something he did not want to show, and it disappeared just as quickly as it came, replaced by that same composed mask. But it was enough to confirm what I had been trying not to admit. This was not one-sided. This was not just me getting lost in something that was never meant to be real. Something had changed for him too, and that realization did not make things easier. It made them worse, because now I could not pretend that I was the only one breaking the rules. And as the car slowed to a stop in front of the next event, cameras already waiting outside, I felt that tightness in my chest return, sharper this time, because I knew stepping out there would be easy, playing the role would be easy, but coming back from whatever this was becoming, that was not going to be easy at all. The moment the car door opened, the world rushed back in like a wave, flashes of cameras, voices overlapping, names being called, and I barely had time to breathe before Nathan's hand found mine again, firm, steady, undeniable, and just like that the role snapped back into place, easy, practiced, seamless, like none of the tension from minutes ago had followed us out here, like everything between us could be neatly contained within the boundaries of a public performance. And I stepped out beside him, shoulders back, expression controlled, the version of myself I had learned to present when people were watching, because this part one understood. This part had rules, clear ones, predictable ones, smile when they look, lean in when they ask, let him take the lead. And he did. Of course he did, guiding me through the crowd with effortless precision, greeting people, answering questions, his voice smooth and confident, every movement deliberate. And I followed, matching his rhythm, responding just enough, letting the illusion build, letting them see exactly what they expected to see, a perfect image, clean, convincing, untouchable. And for a while it worked. For a while I almost forgot everything else, almost convinced myself that this was all there was, just a job, just a role I could step into and out of without consequence. Until someone asked the wrong question. So how did the two of you meet? It came from a reporter standing just a few feet away, microphone angled perfectly, camera already focused, and I felt it instantly. That subtle shift in the air, because this was not one of the rehearsed questions, not one of the safe ones we had prepared for. And for half a second I hesitated, just enough for doubt to creep in, just enough for the reality of everything to catch up with me. And then Nathan's hand tightened slightly around mine. Grounding, steady, a silent cue. And he answered smoothly, like he had been waiting for it. Unexpectedly, he said, a faint hint of something softer in his tone, something that made people lean in without realizing it. And then he glanced at me, not for the cameras, not for the performance, but for me, like he was inviting me into something unscripted, something real, and my breath caught, because that look did not belong here, not in front of all these people, not in a moment that was supposed to be controlled, and I forced a small smile, playing along. Because that was what I was supposed to do, because stepping out of line now would ruin everything. It was not planned, I added, keeping my voice light, careful, but there was something else under it, something I could not quite hide, something that made the moment feel heavier than it should have. And the reporter smiled, clearly satisfied, already turning to the next question, already moving on, but I could not, because Nathan had not looked away yet, because his gaze was still on me. Steady, searching, like he was trying to see past the version of me everyone else was watching. And for a second it felt like everything else faded. The noise, the lights, the crowd, all of it blurring at the edges, leaving just the space between us, too close, too quiet, too real. And then it broke, just like before, clean and controlled. He turned, answered another question, shifted his attention elsewhere, and I was left standing there trying to steady my breathing, trying to remind myself that this was still a performance, still something temporary, still something that would end. But as the event continued and his hand found mine again, not for the cameras this time, not because anyone was watching, just because he could, I realized something that made my chest tighten all over again. It was not the questions or the attention or even the act itself that was getting to me anymore. It was the moments that slipped through when none of it was required, the ones that felt real without permission. And as I glanced at him, expecting that familiar distance, that controlled indifference, I found something else instead, something quieter, something deeper, something that made it impossible to ignore the truth any longer. This was not just a deal anymore, not for him, not for me. And the line we were supposed to stay behind was already gone by the time the event ended. My smile felt like it had been stitched into place, polite, effortless, completely convincing, and that was the problem, because I was getting too good at this, too comfortable in a role that was never meant to feel natural. And as we stepped out into the cool night air, the city quieter now, the crowd fading behind us, I expected that familiar shift, the one where everything dropped, where the act dissolved and we returned to something neutral, distant, safe. But it did not happen, not this time, because Nathan did not let go of my hand right away, even when there was no one left to see it, even when the cameras were gone and the expectations had disappeared with them. And I noticed, of course I noticed, because every small change felt louder now, every unnecessary touch harder to ignore, and I slowly pulled my hand back, not sharply, just enough to create space, to remind myself that I still could, that I was not completely lost in whatever this was becoming. And he let me, but his gaze lingered, steady, unreadable, like he was waiting for something, like he expected me to say something, and I almost did, the words sitting right there, heavy, dangerous, but I swallowed them down because saying them would make this real in a way I was not ready for, and instead I turned slightly, looking toward the waiting car, grounding myself in something familiar, something predictable. That went well, I said, keeping my tone light, neutral, like this was just another successful appearance, another box checked, another step toward the end of a contract that was supposed to be temporary. And he did not answer right away, which again felt like too much, like silence carried more weight with him than words ever could. And then he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to shift it, just enough to make the air between us feel tighter. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, lower, like this was not meant for anyone else. "You keep pretending this is still simple," he said, and my chest tightened instantly because that was not part of the script. That was not something we were supposed to acknowledge out loud, and I forced a small smile, defensive without meaning to be. "It is simple," I replied, because if I said it enough times maybe it would become true again. Maybe I could push everything else back into place, back into something manageable. But he shook his head slightly, not dismissive, not cold, just certain, and that certainty unsettled me more than anything. "No," he said, and the word was quiet but final, like he had already reached a conclusion I was still trying to avoid, and for a moment neither of us moved. The city humming softly around us, distant traffic, muted conversations, everything continuing like normal, while something between us was clearly not, and I felt it again, that pull, that tension that had nothing to do with cameras or contracts, something real pressing against the edges of everything we had agreed on, and I did not know what to do with it, did not know how to step back without losing something I was not supposed to want in the first place. And then he did something that completely broke whatever fragile control I had left. He reached up, fingers brushing lightly against my sleeve, not fixing anything, not adjusting anything, just touching, simple, intentional, unnecessary, and I froze for half a second, because that was not part of the deal, because there was no reason for it, because it felt like something honest slipping through whether we wanted it to or not. And when I looked at him, really looked this time, I saw it clearly, not hidden, not masked, something real in his expression, something that made it impossible to keep pretending that this was still just an arrangement. And my breath caught as the realization settled in, heavier than anything before. This was no longer something I could control, no longer something I could walk away from without consequences. And the most terrifying part was not that he had crossed the line. It was that I was standing there, not moving, not stopping him, already too far gone to pretend I wanted to. The silence stretched longer than it should have, thick and quiet, like the city itself was holding its breath with us, and I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my sleeve, light, but impossible to ignore, like it had left something behind that I could not shake off no matter how much I tried to tell myself this was nothing, just another moment, just another slip, but it did not feel like nothing. It felt like something that had been building for days finally breaking through, and I forced myself to take a small step back, creating distance, needing it, because standing that close to him made everything harder to think through, harder to control, and control was the only thing I had left. "We should go," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, like even speaking too loudly might make this more real than it already was. And for a second I thought he would argue, thought he would say something else that would push this further, but he did not. He just nodded once, sharp and contained, like he was pulling himself back as well, like whatever had just surfaced was something he was not ready to fully let out either. And we got into the car without another word, the door closing with a soft, final sound that felt heavier than it should have, sealing us into a space that suddenly felt too small again, too close, too aware. And I turned my gaze to the window, watching the city blur past, lights streaking into lines that made everything look unreal, distant, easier to ignore, because looking at him right now would be a mistake. And I knew it. I could feel it. The pull was still there, stronger now, more defined, and I did not trust myself not to react to it, not to say something I could not take back. And the silence continued, not empty, never empty, just full of things neither of us was saying, until he finally broke it. "You asked me something last night," he said, his voice calm but quieter than usual, like this conversation was not meant to exist outside of this moment. And my chest tightened instantly because I knew exactly what he meant, knew exactly which question he was referring to, the one I had tried to brush off, the one I had hoped he would ignore, and I kept my eyes on the window, steady, controlled, even as my thoughts started to race. "I did," I answered carefully, because denying it would be pointless, because pretending it had not happened would only make this worse. And there was a pause, just long enough to make the next moment feel heavier, more deliberate. "Do you want an answer?" he asked. And that was the problem, because I did not know if I did not know if hearing it would fix anything or break everything completely. And for a second I considered saying no, considered shutting this down before it could go any further, before it could become something I could not manage. But the truth was already there, sitting in my chest, impossible to ignore. I wanted to know, even if it made things worse. Especially if it made things worse. And I finally turned my head, meeting his gaze for the first time since we got into the car. And it hit me again, that intensity, that focus, like he was not looking through me, not looking past me, just at me, like I was something worth paying attention to, and that alone was enough to undo the careful distance I had been trying to create. Yes, I said, the word quiet but steady, and his expression shifted just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice. But I saw it. I felt it, like something had settled into place, like a decision had already been made. And then he leaned in just a fraction, not enough to invade my space, just enough to close the distance between us, just enough to make everything feel sharper, more immediate. Then stop pretending you do not already know, he said softly, and my breath caught, because he was right, because I did know. I had known for a while now, and hearing it from him was not going to change that. It was only going to make it impossible to ignore. And as the car continued down the darkened street, the city moving on around us like nothing had changed, I realized something that made my chest feel tight all over again. We were past the point of pretending, past the point of simple, and whatever came next was not going to follow any rules we had agreed on at the beginning. The words settled between us like something irreversible, quiet but heavy, and I felt it immediately. The shift from something uncertain into something undeniable. Because he was right. I did know. I had known for a while. I just had not said it out loud, had not allowed it to take shape in a way that could not be undone. And now that he had said it, now that he had looked at me like that, like I was not just part of an arrangement, but something more, there was no clean way to step back, no simple way to return to what this used to be. And I swallowed, my throat suddenly tight, my thoughts scrambling for something, anything, that could put distance back between us. You are assuming a lot, I said finally, forcing the words out, forcing them to sound steady even though they felt anything but, because denial was easier, denial was safer, and for a second I thought he might let me have that, might step back, might give me the space I was trying to create. But he did not. He just watched me, calm, focused, like he could see straight through it, like he knew exactly what I was doing and why. And that made it worse, made it harder to pretend this was still something I could control. No, he said quietly, and there was something in his tone this time, something firmer, less distant, like he was done pretending too. I am stating what is already there. And my chest tightened again, sharp and immediate, because hearing it like that, hearing him acknowledge it without hesitation, without doubt, made everything feel too real, too close. And I looked away, breaking eye contact because holding it felt like standing too close to something I was not ready to face. The city lights blurring past the window again. But this time they did not help, they did not distract, because everything I was trying to ignore was sitting right beside me, steady, patient, waiting, and I hated that he was not pushing, not forcing, just letting the silence stretch until I had no choice but to fill it, until I had no choice but to face what I had been avoiding, and my hands tightened slightly in my lap. A small, unnoticed movement, but it grounded me just enough to speak again. This was supposed to be temporary. I said, quieter now, less defensive, more honest than I meant it to be, because that was the truth, that had always been the truth. This had an end, a clear one. 6 weeks, and then we walked away, no complications, no attachments, no damage. And he nodded once, like he understood that, like he had not forgotten. But there was something else in his expression now, something that made it clear that understanding did not mean agreement. It still is, he replied, and that should have reassured me, should have made everything easier, but it did not, because there was a pause after it, just long enough to matter. Unless you decide it is not, he added, and my breath caught, sharp and unexpected, because that was not part of the deal. That choice had never been presented before. It had always been structured, controlled, defined by rules that kept everything contained. And now he was shifting that, opening something I was not prepared for, something I had not agreed to. And I turned back to him without thinking, caught off guard, because this was not just about him anymore, not just about what he was feeling or what he was admitting. This was about me, about what I wanted, about whether I was willing to let this become something more than it was supposed to be. And that was the part that scared me the most. Because I did not know the answer, did not know if I could trust myself with something like that. Something that felt this real, this unpredictable. And as the car slowed, pulling up in front of the building, the moment, tightening around us one last time before it broke, I realized something that made everything even more complicated. This was no longer about whether the deal was real or not. It was about whether I was willing to stop pretending that what I felt was not. The car came to a smooth stop, the engine going quiet, as if even it knew this moment mattered more than anything we had said before, and for a second neither of us moved. The city lights reflecting faintly through the tinted windows, casting soft shadows that made everything feel slower, heavier, like time itself was hesitating, waiting to see what we would do next, and I stared at the door handle, my hand hovering just slightly above it. Because stepping out would be easy, stepping out would mean ending this moment, pushing everything back into something manageable, something defined, something that could still be controlled. But I did not open it. Not yet. Because his words were still there, lingering, echoing in a way I could not ignore, unless you decide it is not. And I hated how much that stayed with me, how much it shifted everything I thought I understood about this arrangement. Because suddenly it was not just a contract anymore, not just something I could follow until it ended. Now it was a choice, my choice, and that made it real in a way I had not agreed to, in a way I had not prepared for. You are changing the terms, I said quietly, not accusing, not angry, just stating it because it was the only thing that made sense, and he did not deny it, did not correct me, just watched me with that same steady focus that had been undoing me piece by piece since the beginning. I am giving you one, he replied, and that was worse, because it sounded simple, it sounded reasonable, but it was not. Not when I knew what it meant, not when I could feel the weight of it pressing against everything I had been trying to hold on to. And I let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly, creating space even though it felt pointless, because distance did not change what was already there, did not undo the way my thoughts kept circling back to him, to every small moment that had slipped through the cracks of something that was supposed to be controlled. And if I do not take it? I asked, my voice softer now, more uncertain than I wanted it to be, because this was not just a question, it was a line, one I knew we were standing right on the edge of, and his gaze did not waver, did not shift, like he had already thought about this, like he had already decided what his answer would be long before I asked. Then we finish what we started, he said, calm, measured, like this was still something that could be contained, something that could be closed neatly if I chose it, and that should have made it easier, should have given me an out, a way to step back into something safe, something temporary, something that would not leave anything behind when it ended. But it did not feel like an out. It felt like a loss, like choosing that would mean pretending everything that had happened between us meant nothing. And I knew that was not true, not anymore, not after everything that had shifted, everything that had changed without either of us saying it out loud. And my fingers tightened slightly against my palm, grounding myself, trying to hold on to something solid, because everything else felt like it was slipping. And I finally looked at him again, really looked this time, not at the composed version he showed the world, but at the one sitting right beside me, close enough to feel real, and I saw it clearly, that same thing I had been trying to ignore, something steady, something certain, something that was not going away just because I refused to acknowledge it, and my breath caught, because the truth was right there, unavoidable now. This was not just about him offering me a choice. It was about whether I was ready to admit that I had already made one. And as the silence settled between us again, quieter this time, but no less heavy, I realized something that made my chest tighten all over again. I was not afraid of losing the deal anymore. I was afraid of what it would mean if I did not choose him. The silence did not break this time. It settled, deep and steady, like something final had already been decided, and neither of us was brave enough to say it out loud first. And I could feel it in the way my chest rose and fell a little too carefully, like even breathing too loudly might tip everything over, and my hand was still hovering near the door handle, still not moving. Because leaving now felt like more than just stepping out of a car. It felt like choosing something, like closing one path before I even understood what the other one meant. And that thought alone was enough to keep me still. You always do this, I said quietly, not even sure why I said it. the words slipping out before I could stop them, and his gaze sharpened just slightly, not defensive, not surprised, just attentive, like he was listening in a way that made it impossible to take the words back. Do what? He asked, and his voice was calm, but there was something underneath it now, something more present, more engaged than before, and I let out a breath, shaking my head faintly because explaining it felt impossible, because putting this into words would make it real in a way I was still trying to avoid, but I said it anyway. You act like everything is controlled until it is not, and then you expect me to just follow. And the moment the words left my mouth, I felt it, that shift, not in him, but in me, like I had crossed a line I had been circling for days, and for a second I wondered if I had said too much, if I had pushed this too far, but he did not pull back, did not retreat into that distant version of himself. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, just enough to close the space I had been trying to keep. I am not asking you to follow, he said, and his voice was lower now, quieter, like this was something meant only for me. I am asking you to stop pretending you are not already here. And my breath caught, because that was the problem. That was exactly the problem. I was already here, already standing in something I did not understand, already feeling things I was not supposed to feel. And hearing him say it like that, so certain, so steady, made it impossible to deny. And I looked at him, really looked this time, searching for something, anything that would make this easier, something that would prove this was still just a moment, still something temporary, but I did not find it. I found something else instead, something that had been there longer than I wanted to admit, something that made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with truth. And I swallowed, my thoughts racing, trying to catch up with a reality I had been avoiding. This was not supposed to happen, I said, softer now, not arguing, not denying, just stating it because it was the only thing I could hold on to, the only thing that still felt certain. And he nodded once, like he understood that, like he had known it from the beginning, but his gaze did not change, did not soften, did not pull away. It still happened, he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty that made everything feel sharper, clearer, harder to ignore. And for a moment the world outside the car disappeared completely, the city, the lights, the noise, all of it, fading until there was nothing left but this space, this moment, this choice sitting between us. And I realized something that made my chest tighten all over again. This was not about the contract anymore, not about the deal or the rules or the end we had planned. This was about whether I was willing to admit that I had already crossed a line I could not come back from. And my hand finally dropped away from the door, not opening it, not leaving, just resting back in my lap, because I knew now, leaving would not make this disappear. It would just make me lie to myself about what was already there. And when I looked back at him, my voice quieter than before but steadier, I said the only thing that felt honest anymore. Then what happens next? Because for the first time since this started, I was not asking about the deal. I was asking about us. The question lingered between us, heavier than anything that had come before it. Because this time there was no script to follow, no contract, clause to hide behind, no easy answer that would keep everything contained. And for a moment Nathan did not respond, not immediately, not with that usual certainty that made everything feel controlled. Instead, he just looked at me, steady and quiet, like he was measuring something, like he was deciding how much of the truth I was ready to hear. And that alone made my chest tighten, because I realized this was not just about what came next. It was about whether I was ready to accept it. That depends, he said finally, his voice lower than before, more deliberate, like every word mattered now in a way it had not before. And I frowned slightly, not because I did not understand, but because I did, because I could already feel where this was going. On what? I asked, even though part of me already knew the answer, and he did not look away, did not break that steady focus that had become impossible to ignore. On whether you are going to keep pretending this ends the way we planned, he said, and there it was, laid out clearly, no ambiguity, no distance, just the truth I had been circling for days. And I felt it again, that tightness in my chest, sharper now, because hearing it out loud made it real in a way I could not avoid anymore. And I looked down for a second, my thoughts racing, trying to find something solid to hold on to, something that would make this easier. But there was nothing, Just the reality of what this had become, something neither of us had planned, but both of us had stepped into anyway. "And if I do not?" I said quietly, my voice softer now, less guarded, because there was no point in pretending I did not understand what he was asking anymore. And he shifted slightly, just enough to close the distance between us again, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to make it clear that this was not a conversation happening from opposite sides anymore. "Then we stop calling it a deal," he said, and my breath caught, sharp and immediate, because that was it. That was the line, the one we had been moving toward without saying it, the one that changed everything. And for a second I did not know what to say, did not know how to respond to something that simple and that complicated at the same time, because it sounded easy, just a change in words, just a shift in how we defined this. But it was not. It meant everything. It meant acknowledging what had been happening between us, what had been building in all those small moments, in every look that lingered too long, every touch that was not necessary, every silence that felt too full. And I could feel it now, clear and undeniable, the truth I had been avoiding settling into place. And I lifted my gaze back to his, meeting it fully this time, not looking away, not trying to create distance, because there was no point anymore, not when everything was already here, already real. "And what would we call it instead?" I asked, my voice steady despite the way my chest felt like it was tightening with every second. And for the first time since this started, since the contract, since the rules, since all the carefully controlled distance, Nathan's expression shifted in a way I had not seen before, something softer, something less guarded, something that made everything feel even more real. "That," he said quietly, "is something we figure out together." And the words settled over me, unexpected and overwhelming at the same time. Because for the first time this was not about an agreement or an obligation or something temporary. This was about something open, something uncertain, something that did not have a clear end. And as I sat there, the city still moving around us like nothing had changed, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. This was not just a question anymore. It was an invitation, and I had no idea if I was ready to accept it. The word "together" lingered in the air long after he said it, soft but heavy, like it carried more weight than anything else we had exchanged tonight. And I felt it settle somewhere deep, somewhere I could not easily ignore or push aside, because that was the problem. It was not a command, not an expectation, not even a demand. It was an option, and somehow that made it harder to deal with than anything else, because it meant this was no longer something I could blame on him or the contract or the situation. This was something I had to choose, and I sat there for a moment, not moving, not speaking, just letting that realization sink in, letting it take shape in a way I had been avoiding since the beginning. And I could feel my heartbeat steady but heavy, like it was waiting for me to decide something I was not sure I was ready for. And I looked down at my hands, resting quietly in my lap, because looking at him felt like too much right now, like I would give something away before I was ready to say it out loud. And I let out a slow breath, trying to sort through everything, trying to separate what I wanted from what I was afraid of, because those two things had become so tangled together I could not tell them apart anymore. And that scared me more than anything. "You make it sound simple," I said finally, my voice quiet but steady, because it needed to be, because if I let it shake even a little I knew everything would spill out in a way I could not control. And he did not interrupt, did not correct me, just listened, which somehow made it worse, because it gave me space, space to think, space to feel, space to realize just how far I had already gone. "It is not," I continued, lifting my gaze slightly, not fully meeting his eyes yet, but close enough to feel the weight of his attention. "Walking away is simple. Finishing this like we planned is simple. But this," I paused, the word catching slightly because I did not know what to call it, because giving it a name would make it real in a way I was still trying to process. "This is not." And there it was, the truth I had been circling finally taking shape. Not clean, not controlled, but honest. And for a moment neither of us spoke. The quiet stretching again, but this time it felt different, less tense, more open, like something had shifted just enough to let the truth exist without being immediately pushed back. And when I finally looked at him, really looked this time, I saw it again, that same steady focus, but softer now, less guarded, like he was not trying to control this moment anymore, just be in it. And that alone made something in my chest tighten in a way that felt less like fear and more like something else I was not ready to name. Then do not make it simple, he said, and his voice was quieter than before, but there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just certainty that made everything feel sharper, clearer, and harder to ignore, and I blinked slightly, caught off guard by how direct that was, by how easily he said something I had been struggling to even admit to myself. And for a second I did not know how to respond, because he was right, because maybe the problem was not that this was complicated. Maybe the problem was that I kept trying to force it into something simple so I would not have to deal with what it actually was. And I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, because there was nothing funny about this, nothing easy about the way everything between us had changed, and I leaned back slightly, not to create distance this time, but just to steady myself, to give myself a moment to think without feeling like I was about to fall into something I could not control. And the city outside was still there, still moving, still unchanged. But inside this car, everything felt different. Everything felt like it had shifted into something new, something uncertain, something real. And as I looked back at him, my chest tightening again, but for a different reason now, I realized something that made everything else fall into place. I was not trying to decide whether I wanted this anymore. I was trying to decide if I was brave enough to admit that I already did. The realization settled quietly, but completely, like something that had been waiting all along for me to finally catch up to it, and I felt it in the way my chest rose, steadier now, less panicked, less uncertain, like something inside me had shifted into place even if I could not fully explain how. And for the first time since this started, I did not look away from him, did not try to create distance or hide behind something safer, because there was nothing left to hide behind anymore. Not when everything between us had already crossed the lines we had drawn at the beginning, and the silence that followed was not heavy this time, not tense. It was different, quieter, like it was waiting for something simple, something honest. And I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of that choice still there, but no longer overwhelming, no longer something I wanted to run from. I do not know what this is yet, I said finally, my voice calm, steady in a way it had not been before, because that was the truth, because pretending to have all the answers would only make this easier in the wrong way. And I did not want easy anymore, not if it meant ignoring what this had become, and his gaze did not waver, did not interrupt, just stayed with me, present in a way that felt grounding instead of overwhelming. And I continued, the words coming more naturally now, less forced, less guarded. But I know it is not nothing. And there it was, the line I had been avoiding finally spoken out loud. Simple but real, and I saw it, the slight shift in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, like something had eased, like something had been waiting for exactly that. And for a moment neither of us moved, the space between us still close, still quiet, but no longer uncertain in the same way it had been before, and I felt it again, that pull, but it was different now, less like something pulling me off balance, and more like something I was choosing to step toward, even if I did not know exactly where it would lead. And I let my hand rest where it was, not pulling away this time, not creating distance, just letting it be there between us, open, unguarded. And for a second he looked at it, then back at me, like he was giving me the chance to take it back, to step away if I wanted to. But I did not. I stayed, and that alone felt like an answer, even if I had not fully said it yet. And when he finally reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against mine, it was not sudden, not overwhelming, just there, simple and deliberate, and I did not pull away, did not hesitate, because this time it did not feel like crossing a line. It felt like acknowledging one that had already been crossed a long time ago, and the contact was quiet, steady, real in a way that made everything else fade just slightly, enough to make this moment stand out. And I met his gaze again, holding it without looking away, because there was no reason to anymore, and something in my chest settled, fully for the first time, like the uncertainty had shifted into something clearer, something I could finally stand on, even if it was still new, still undefined. And I let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, but softer, because this was not something I had planned, not something I had agreed to at the start, but it was here anyway, and I was done pretending it was not. So we figure it out, I said, the words simple but steady, and he nodded once, not rushed, not forced, just certain, and For the first time since everything started, that certainty did not feel like pressure. It felt like something I could step into without losing myself. And as we finally moved, stepping out of the car together into the quiet night, the city still stretching endlessly around us, I realized something that made everything feel just a little bit lighter. The deal might have been where this started, but it was no longer what was keeping us here. And whatever this was becoming, it was ours now, not defined by rules or endings or expectations. Just something real that we had chosen to face together, even if we did not know exactly where it would lead next.